What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining me today as we embark on a pretty big maintenance job for the Evo. It's been one that I've been putting off for a little bit, but it's finally time to just jump into this, and we're going to be replacing the timing belt, balancer belt, and the water pump on my Evo 8. This is a pretty sizable job. There's just a lot of components that go into it, but we're going to be taking our time, being super cautious. We're going to follow the workshop manual as closely as possible and reduce any shortcuts or anything like that. So I'm sure you could do it faster, but today we're just going to be super careful, because if you do set the timing incorrectly, there is a chance for piston valves hidden, and we do not want to worry about that today. So I'm going to try to be as comprehensive as possible and take you along as we replace this timing belt. And as you can see, my Evo is currently bumperless, and that is because it is getting repainted at the shop. We'll get that fixed up shortly, but the first thing that we're going to do is get the car in the air, drain the coolant, and take off this wheel right here. Next thing we'll do is remove this 12mm bolt holding on this power steering hose. Next we'll remove the 4 bolts that are holding the upper timing cover. These are 10mm. Next we'll remove the 2 10mm nuts holding on our power steering reservoir. Alright, next we're going to remove this motor mount right here. There's a 19mm nut right here and a 17mm bolt. But before we remove that, we're going to want to support the engine. So we're going to put a jack with a block of wood underneath the engine and support it from this side. Now we'll take the 3 14mm nuts holding the mount to the engine. Next we'll go under the car and take off this cover. Mine has 4 of these push type clips remaining. I'm sure there's probably more. Next we'll remove our water pump pulley as well as our crank pulley. The first thing that I'm going to do though before I take off the belt is just loosen the bolts. So here's the water pump right here. There's 4 10mm bolts, and what I've done is jacked up this side of the engine just a tad bit more. I'm going to use a small little socket to take out 1 bolt at a time, and then I'll rotate the engine and just keep going. Just to give you guys some more perspective, those are the 4 bolts that we're trying to remove right there. And at this point, it's also good to note that you should have bags with all the bolts and stuff organized, just so you don't forget which ones go where and misplace them and all of that. All right, now we're gonna crack the 4 12mm bolts on the crank pulley. All right, so to get the Serpentine belt off, we just have to put a 1/2-inch socket on that tensioner right there, and we'll just push that to the left, and that will release tension in the belt, and then we'll just pull it off. There's also this hole right here that will line up with this hole right here once it's in its relaxed position, and we could put a Allen key in there to hold the tension off. Now we can take off our water pump pulley. And now we're going to remove this idler pulley. It's a 14mm bolt. So now we're going to take off the auto tensioner for the Serpentine belt. There is a 12mm bolt right here, and then a 14 right here. And as a side note, I finally took off this fender liner. After bumping into it 20 times, it finally annoyed me enough to remove it. Now we'll take off our crank pulley. It's these 4 12mm bolts. All right, now we could take off the lower cover. There's 7 10mm bolts. They're kind of scattered around the perimeter of the cover. So now we're going to relocate this power steering pump temporarily so that we could have access to the timing belt idler. So first we're just going to disconnect the switch, and then there's 2 bolts holding on this heat shield, so we'll remove those next, and then we'll go from there. Next we'll remove the power steering pump from its bracket. As you can see, the pump mounts to the bracket with 2 on the bottom, 1 on the top right, and then 1 on the top left. Next we'll remove the bracket that mounts to the engine. There's 2 over here, and then 2 on the other side. All 4 are 14mm. Alright guys, I think it's time to lock this motor at TDC. We'll be using this cam gear holder to lock the gears in place. But before we do all that, let's make sure that we point out all of the markings for the respective components. So our cam gears have this marking, as you can see, and it should match up to the valve cover. And down here, you'll see that our crank sprocket has a little indicator right there. Up there, we have another indicator at the rear balance shaft. And then there's also going to be one at this oil pump sprocket right here. But as you can see, it is currently not in phase with the rest of the motor, and that is because I believe this is only in phase every 3 rotations. So basically every 3 rotations of this TDC will line up with the rest of the marks. So let's just look at these real quick so you guys are familiar with it. And what we're going to do is rotate the crank a few more times until all of these components are all synced up. We'll use a 22mm socket on that crank bolt. Let's just double check all of our markings real quick. We have our 2 cam gears lining up with our valve cover. Down here we have our oil pump sprocket, as well as our crank gear. And then up there we have our rear balance shaft. Alright, so we are good to remove this timing belt. Alright, so to remove the belt, first we have to relieve tension on it. And to do that, we have that tensioner arm pulley right there. And that is a 14mm bolt. And that arm connects to the auto tensioner, so we'll remove that after, but first we're just going to remove this bolt right here. And I think it might be easier to get to from the top.
Pick up the phone.
Alright, so now we're going to remove the auto tensioner as well as the tensioner arm. All 3 of these bolts are 12mm. Alright, next we're going to remove this idler pulley right here. It's a 14mm bolt, and I think it's easier to get to from the top. Now here comes the fun part. Time to remove this crank bolt, and then we'll start removing the components behind it. Hopefully we could break this with my electric impact. We'll see how it goes. Alright, now we're going to take out the 2 bolts holding this crank angle sensor in. They're 10 mils. Take off the sprocket as well as the sensor blade. Make sure not to flip this in the wrong direction, so I just made a mark so I'll remember that this is the top. Alright, now we'll remove our balancer belt, but to do that first we'll have to remove this tensioner. It's a 12mm bolt. The one thing you want to note is to see how much tension there is on the belt before you take it off, just to get an idea. I do have a tension deflection gauge, but it's always a good idea just to see how it was set prior. Alright, now at this point we're going to take off the water pump. So as you can see, it's right underneath the intake cam gear. There is one of the bolts that passes through the alternator bracket, so I think what we're going to do is loosen up that bracket, remove the bolt, and we should be able to swing that arm out. I think I'll get a few bolts from the top and a few from the bottom, but let's give it a shot. Alright guys, so hopefully you are able to see, but basically we're able to remove the top alternator bolt and loosen the bottom one, and we're able to swing that bracket to the left, leaving our water pump completely exposed, so we should be able to just tug that out. Alright, so here's our old water pump. I put the bolts in their correct places so I wouldn't forget. As you can see, there is some gasket material, so we'll want to clean up the area where this mounts, and then we'll get to work on mounting our new one. There's also an O-ring on the pipe that connects to the water pump towards the back of the motor, so you'll want to make sure to remove that and replace it as well. So here is our new water pump. First thing what we're going to do is put some thermostat and water pump specific sealant on here to help hold the gasket in place when we install the water pump. And now we'll reinstall our O-ring. Before we do that, we're just going to add some grease to it. Now that our water pump is back in place, along with our alternator bracket, we can tighten our bolts to 124 plus or minus 8 inch-pounds. Alright, at this point we're going to get our crank and our rear balance shaft at their TDC marks, and we're going to install our new balancer belt with no slack on this side. Next we'll install our tensioner. You'll want the lip on the outside preventing the belt from moving out. And we're going to install it in this orientation, where we basically have the center of the pulley to the top left of the bolt. Next we'll push the pulley clockwise so that it applies tension to our belt, and we'll tighten this bolt to 14 plus or minus 2 foot-pounds. Keep in mind you don't want to over tighten this. If this starts to spin while you're tightening it, that means you've applied too much torque. Alright, so we have our belt tensioned, and just by feel it definitely feels like the appropriate amount of tension compared to the old belt that I took off. But what we're going to do is actually validate that the tension is appropriate. So I have this straight edge ruler that's parallel to the belt, and it's offset 1/4 inch. Now the spec calls for 0.2 to 0.27 inches of deflection, so this is 0.25 right now, and the spec calls for a force of 22 pounds the center of the belt, and basically if you put 22 pounds of force here, it should deflect between that range. So what we're going to do is use this deflection gauge, and we're going to spec it out to 1/4 inch, and we'll see how much force we apply. We should see a force of 22 pounds. If not, we'll have to adjust the tension. Alright, so this gauge basically shows that I used a force of about 21 pounds to move it 1/4 inch. So I think we're good to go. But we're just going to make sure and take a reading again and just verify that we get the same amount of force. So now we'll degrease our crank sprocket, sensing blade, as well as our bolt. Alright, so first we're going to install our sensor blade. We're going to want to make sure this is in the right orientation. Hopefully you marked it before. It should line up with this TDC mark over here if you have it right. Then we'll install our sprocket next. You're going to want to make sure the flat side is facing the engine. So we'll install our crank bolt. You're going to want to make sure that the washer flat side is facing the engine. And we're also going to apply some oil on the threads as well as on the bolt head. Alright, so now we're going to torque this crank bolt to 123 foot-pounds, and to hold it in place I've got this little tool right here. It's going to rest against the AC compressor, so we'll bolt this up and then torque it down. Next we'll install our new auto tensioner with the pin still installed, and we'll torque these two 12mm bolts to 17 plus or minus 2 foot-pounds. After wiping down our crank sensor, we could reinstall it and torque the two 10mm bolts down to 78 plus or minus 8 inch-pounds. Alright, and now we're going to install our new idler pulley. This is going to get torqued down to 26 plus or minus 4 foot-pounds. Alright, so now we're going to install our tensioner arm, but before we do that, we're just going to add some grease to the piece where it pivots on right here. And we'll torque the 12mm bolt to 16 plus or minus 2 foot-pounds. You're going to want to make sure when you torque this down that when you're torquing it, the arm does not move with the bolt. If you've done that, that means you've tightened it way too much. Now we're going to install our new tensioner pulley, and we're going to install it with the holes perpendicular to this tensioner arm bolt over here. So it should look like that. Alright guys, well we have pretty much made it to the point where we're going to install the timing belt. However, before we do that, we just want to make sure all of our marks line up. We have our crank sprocket, our rear balance shaft up here, as well as our cams, which are locked in place. But the last one is this front oil pump sprocket. Now this can still show TDC, but be out of phase with the rear shaft. So that would be bad because it'll cause vibrations and all types of stuff that you don't want. So there is a way of validating that this is in phase, and that involves sticking a screwdriver in the side of the block. But this is pretty much going to be the only shortcut we take here, and it's a well-known trick, I think started in the DSM community, where if you're in phase, you'll see that this mark wants to fall towards the TDC mark. As you can see, if I go left, it'll want to go right towards the mark. If I go right, it's going to want to go left towards the mark, as you can see. So if we were out of phase, I'll go complete revolution this way, you would still think that we're on the TDC mark, but as you can see, when I try to rotate, it wants to rotate away from the mark. So that's no good, so we're going to go back to how we had it. And just to show you again, it's going back towards the mark, so we'll lock this in place right here. And we're going to install our timing belt, starting with our crank sprocket, followed by the oil pump sprocket, and then go around the idler pulley. At this point, we finally have our timing belt on. It's a little tricky because of all the space constraints. It'll probably take you a few tries, but eventually you'll get it and you have all the marks lining up. We have our cams, which can't move, and we also have our oil pump, our crank, as well as our rear balance shaft, all in time. Now we're going to go through the process of setting the tension. Alright, so at this point we have our auto tensioner installed on the motor, but what happens is when you get a new one, it's compressed from the factory, and there's a little grenade pin that goes through. You can see the two holes that line up. So right now you can't pull it out freely. What you have to do is use another special tool to push down the tensioner arm, so that this pin moves freely. So we're gonna go ahead and thread this into the special port on the block. I'll show you guys that now. All right, so as you can see, there's this plug right here. We'll pull that plug out and then slowly thread this in until we can remove that pin. So you don't really have to screw in the rod as much as you think. Once you start screwing it in, I was actually below the car and feeling the grenade pin while I was screwing it in, and I was able to basically stop once I felt the pin getting loose. Let's jump under the car and I'll show you what it looks like. And here's the pin right here. As you can see, you could pull it out easily and then drop it back in. So it should be loose. Now we're gonna turn this pulley counterclockwise until we reach a rating of 31 inch-pounds. Alright, so that's all set. Now we'll remove this pin and we'll remove our special tool as well. Now we can also remove our cam lock. And now we'll rotate the crankshaft 2 turns. Alright, so that's 2 turns. We're gonna wait 15 minutes and come back and insert the pin and make sure it goes in and out freely. Alright, so it's been 15 minutes. Hopefully we got the tension right. We'll check by inserting our grenade pin. Sweet. As you can see, it is going in freely. It means our tension is good to go. Alright, so if you made it this far, congrats. You have your new timing belt installed and all the accessories. So pat yourself on the back and take a little break because you just did a good amount of work. Now comes the fun part of reinstalling all the stuff that we pulled out. Alright, so we'll get started by reinstalling our power steering pump bracket. And there's just 4 bolts that hold that in place. And we'll torque these 14 mil bolts to 36 plus or minus 7 foot-pounds. Next, we'll install our pump onto the bracket. We have 3 14 mil bolts and then 1 12 at the top. We'll torque our 12 mil bolt to 16 plus or minus 3 foot-pounds and our 14 mil bolts to 30 plus or minus 3 foot-pounds. Next, we'll install our reservoir. 2 12 mil bolts torqued down to 102 plus or minus 22 inch-pounds. Next, we'll install this power steering pump heat shield with these 2 really annoying 12 mil bolts torqued down to 16 plus or minus 3 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install our lower timing cover. I ordered some new bolts from STM, and it also came with this handy little diagram to let us know where each bolt goes. So let's get that sorted out. Now we're going to reinstall our accessory belt auto tensioner. We've got this bolt right here. This is going to get torqued to 33 plus or minus 7 foot-pounds, and this smaller bolt is 18 plus or minus 3 foot-pounds. Next, we'll install our idler pulley. This bolt gets tightened down to 59 plus or minus 3 foot-pounds. And then we'll install our water pump pulley. These smaller bolts get torqued down to 78 plus or minus 9 inch-pounds. And now we'll install our crank pulley. These 4 bolts get torqued down to 18 plus or minus 3 foot-pounds. And you're going to want to make sure to line up this hole with the pin on the sprocket. Alright, and now we're going to install the upper cover. I got one of these on Amazon for 20 bucks, and I just got OEM seals. Comes with these pretty ugly purple seals, so I swapped those out, and I think this should look pretty clean. Now we'll install our new accessory belt, and then we'll release our auto tensioner. Now we'll reinstall our engine mount. So we'll torque these 3 nuts to 50 plus or minus 5 foot-pounds. And we'll torque the bigger 19 mil nut to 73 plus or minus 7 foot-pounds. And you've got a 17 mil bolt head on the other end to hold. After all of that work, it's finally time to start the car. Crossing my fingers. I think we did everything right, but it's always nerve-wracking this first start. So we'll just hope for the best, and after it starts, we'll just check for leaks or anything odd. But let's try it out. And that is going to do it for today's timing belt video. As you guys could probably tell, it's really not too bad. You just have to work with some tight quarters and have some patience, and you could definitely get the job done. If you learned something new or enjoyed the video, press that like button and consider subscribing. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.